We are joined today by a veterinarian who specializes in large animal medicine. His name is Dr. Callan. He's a professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Clinical Sciences and a service coordinator of the Livestock Medicine and Surgery Service at Colorado State University, James L. Voss Veterinary Teaching Hospital. And he's got many research interests, including livestock, infectious disease, medicine, and surgery. If there is a topic about large animal medicine, livestock, and infectious disease, there's no one that I would want to talk to more than Dr. Callan. So let's welcome to the podcast, Dr. Callan. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Dr. Courtney, it's a pleasure to be here. This is an exciting time, an interesting topic, and I'm sure glad to participate in this.
In this fight against COVID-19, I really want to jump right into some of the most scintillating information and topics that are coming out in the past couple of weeks, and that is regarding llamas being involved in the fight against COVID-19. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain about some of this news and research that's coming out, particularly around the topic of nano antibodies. For all those out there who may not be familiar with antibodies, you essentially have an army in your immune system, and this army is designed to neutralize threats, kill threats, and it's a complex, extremely well orchestrated, or I should say a complicated orchestra of cells that are designed to neutralize threats. And one particular type of soldier in this army, something called the nano antibody. Could you talk to us a little bit about why llamas may be one of our best friends in this fight against COVID-19?
Yeah, so this is really, really interesting research, and I'll break it into some bites here and see if we can kind of break this one down.
Please, yes, please, because this is something that so many people are craving to learn more about.
Yeah, so normal or conventional antibodies throughout mammals are basically made up of 4 chains of proteins. So there's, I'm trying to put my fingers on up here and kind of make it look like it, but basically an antibody has 2 heavy chains, the bottoms of my arms,
right?
And they continue on up, and then they bind to also 2 light chains, and they kind of come up into a Y or a fork like this. And that's a normal antibody for us as humans and all the other mammals that are on the earth. But camels have developed this ability to make a single heavy chain antibody. So instead of this big forked antibody with this smaller light chain on it, it actually is a single antibody that comes on up and forks as this heavy chain, but it's cut out a bunch of pieces, and it's not nearly as big. So that's the first thing that's interesting, is one, it's not as big, and that lets it get into places that these bigger normal antibodies can't get into. Then researchers have taken that, and what they can do now is they can go in and they can activate the immune system in a llama or an alpaca or a camel if they want, and then pull out the B cells that are making these heavy chain antibodies and find the B cells that are making the antibody that is specific for something that they're looking for. And then once they identify that, they can take that cell, expand that cell and grow it on up, and then find the gene that is making that specific antibody. And then, what's even cooler at that point, is they can then take just the end point. So you've got the heavy chain here, and then you've got this variable region that's sticking off like this. They can take this little tiny variable region here, and that's called the nanobody, and they can go and synthesize that, and they can actually synthesize it in bacteria or in human cells or even in yeast. And they've got this little tiny molecule that is very, very, has a really high ability to go and find the antigen that it looks for and bind to it. And that's the key. It's this very nice.
Interesting. So not only do they, I think that's really part of the essence and the beauty behind the story, is that they're not just isolating the nano antibody, they isolate the B cell that's actually producing those antibodies. Then once they find the gene that's replicating those antibodies, then from those antibodies, they can find the antibody that's part of that nanobody. And then at that point, then they can synthesize that in other cells.
Yes, yes. And because they can then synthesize it in other
Okay.
cells like bacteria or yeast, this is something that's very scalable. So you can actually make quite a bit of these small nanobodies as you scale that on up. And that would be important if this
Now,
becomes.
when you say this is scalable and you can make a lot of them, that's really appealing to a lot of people, because that's one thing that struck me about these nanobodies or nano antibodies, is that they're extremely stable and they seem like they last for a long time, or at least that's what the reports are indicating. Is that does that jive with what you've obviously know and your expertise?
Yeah, so there's two parts. One, it's stable. So it's stable from a standpoint of storage standpoint. So
Yeah.
we can put it into a vial and it'll last quite a while until it gets reconstituted. The other interesting thing is, because it's a smaller protein, it is not as antigenic. So we've heard in the news already about people getting treated for COVID-19 with convalescent plasma from people who have
Yes.
recovered as a potential treatment. But those antibodies, being bigger proteins, are immune system. So if I got that, my immune system would eventually start reacting against those foreign proteins and start destroying them.
Exactly.
But these nanobodies are smaller and they're less susceptible to my immune system reacting against them and destroying them. So we've got a small molecule. It can get into our body and we can deliver it, but then also it can stay there for a reasonable period of time.
Yeah, so not only, okay, a small molecule, it may prevent, and again, I have to couch all of this in that all of this research is preliminary. There's plenty of hurdles that they still need to climb in terms of using this clinically, but it's just so fascinating and extremely enthralling that I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about it. But so you've got a small nanobody that's stable, can be replicated at scale, is less antigenic. And the other component, which you kind of hinted at, is that there's potential that it could be used either at the site of delivery, meaning in the lungs, or it could actually be used as a treatment instead of prevention, which I think there's been a lot of talk in the news about a potential vaccine. Could you talk to us a little bit about how this nanobody could be used as a potential treatment and blocking the virus from entering the cell versus a vaccine, which is something completely different?
Yeah. So I'll relate back, as you say, it's so early in research in so many fronts for COVID-19. Some of the early indications coming on out of, we're going to drop back here to the giving the convalescent plasma. Some
Absolutely.
of the indications of that, so you take blood from a person who's recovered, it has antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, and then you give that blood or that plasma to a person who's currently sick. Some of the work that's coming out on that is showing that it seems that that type of treatment seems to work better earlier in the course of disease. And that makes a lot of sense, because we really need to get and try and stop the virus from replicating and infecting other cells early, before this inflammatory response starts developing and causing all the severe disease. So if we carry that same principle towards using possible nanobodies, by far the best time to possibly use this would be as a blocking agent, as something like, say, maybe it could be taken as an inhaler. I'm dreaming right now, but maybe it could be taken as an inhaler.
Well, you're talking to a guy who takes an inhaler before he runs. So yeah, these dreams, I hope these dreams become a reality for sure. But please continue, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you've got the inhaler and you take a big breath of these nanobodies and they go on down and they coat your airways. And if the virus is there, or if the virus was just starting to replicate, if they bind to that virus, potentially they can stop that virus from infecting the next cell, growing more virus, and then infecting the next cell. So in a treatment, so when you think of our healthcare workers, again, the big call out to all the healthcare workers that are putting their lives at risk to try and treat patients with COVID-19, they're exposed every
100%.
day. And so having something that can help those people that are exposed, or take it further, as we develop more and more testing in the US, and someone goes on through and goes, hey, I think I might have COVID-19, I'm starting to get the symptoms. And they go through and they get a test and they're positive. well then, one, maybe they can be treated at that early stage, but maybe more importantly, their family members or their in-contact workers that are exposed. Maybe then they also could be treated and possibly stop the infection from proceeding from the one infected person onto others. So that
Wow.
preventative aspect could be really, really important in stopping that replication of viral spread from person to person.
You know, the promise regarding this treatment, it sounds so intriguing, because I think that for the longest time, we've been really focused on three main pathways, which is one, mitigation strategies, two, treatment, and then three, the vaccine or prevention strategies. And it's so nice, and sort of, it takes a deep dive into the world of immunology when you talk about a treatment that could straddle one of those two pillars, whether it is treatment and prevention all at the same time. It's truly, truly remarkable stuff. So now that you talked to us a little bit about the future, and everybody's excited like me, I'm kind of geeking out here because you explained that so well. Let's get a dose of reality. What are some of the hurdles that you think they're going to have to encounter before this is ever whatsoever given in a clinical setting or to a person?
Yeah. So the first hurdle really is how do you win? So the research that was done, and this was research that was done in collaboration both by researchers at Texas A&M as well as researchers at Ghent University in Belgium. And the research that's done so far shows that if you take these nanobodies and you mix them into the fluid that's on top of a cell culture in a lab, so it's just cells growing in a petri dish, and you add the virus on in, these nanobodies will bind to the virus, and they will block the virus from being able to attach and enter into these cells. So that's really encouraging, and it does it really, really well. It's very effective at blocking this. Now we have to go to the actual person, the actual human being.
Right.
And when I look at it going, what are the big hurdles? The first hurdle is, how do you get the nanobody in contact with the virus? And early on, we've already talked about, well, what about inhalers? Well, that puts the antibody or the nanobody on the surface of the airways, but pretty rapidly, this coronavirus is infecting cells and potentially invading on into deeper and deeper layers. And so, you know, the question is, how far can the nanobody get into tissues if it's an aerosolized application? Or say it's given as an injectable application and then distributed on into the tissues. Is there enough opportunity where there's free virus for it to bind to and then stop that virus from infecting another cell? That's a big medical question that just isn't known.
Sure.
And it really is.
Right. And so, right. So it's not like it can uncouple a virus from a cell, or at least that's not what I've read. And so the other potential hurdle, like you had described, is the vehicle. You know, how do you get these nanobodies actually to the free virus? That's I think one of the major keys that you're bringing up.
Yeah. So the testing there, obviously safety. We don't know. We presume that there's, you know, that this would be a reasonably safe type of treatment, but that's not known. When to give it, you know, when is it best used? Is it best used prophylactically, like we already discussed, or early in the infection? It looks like later times, if you go back to the plasma transfusions, that applying those after people are already severely ill or on ventilators, that doesn't work as well at that point. So it's something that would probably be identified up front. And then once you kind of have this model, an idea of how you might use it, then comes in the whole licensing aspect.
Safety, yes.
Yeah, got to show safety, have to show efficacy. Until those two things are met, you don't have a product that you can apply to the general public.
And listen, this is, Anything Possible is a space where we really explore the human-animal bond, and nothing really connects the human-animal bond like just talking about llamas potentially being partners in crime and helping to prevent COVID-19, but even just looking at, in a research setting, at which which species seem to be particularly susceptible, or who essentially have angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor that makes them more susceptible to coronavirus. We know about cats, obviously humans, non-human primates, ferrets, Syrian hamsters. But then in some of these research animals like mice and rats, potentially dogs, they seem like they're relatively, at least of now, relatively resistant to this particular virus, which makes all of what you and I just said about putting through screening and safety, makes it a little bit more difficult when the most common species that you'd like to do research on don't really seem to be susceptible to that. Do you look at that as a hurdle or not necessarily?
Yeah, it is a hurdle. They'll start with I'm sure they'll start with animal models if they get to that point.
Sure.
But, at some point still, you're doing safety trials in humans.
That's a huge step. Now, a lot of people are listening saying, llamas, nanoantibodies? I didn't even know that nanoantibodies even existed, or like llamas even had those. But llamas and humans have shared that intersectionality and that human-animal bond for quite a long time, not only just recently with SARS and MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, but even with thousands of years ago. So, when did humans and llamas and camelids like actually interact and and share a relationship, so to speak?
Well, yeah, the whole camelid species is interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, and so
Right.
Since you led me on into that one, I'm gonna take it. Historically, camelids actually developed or started here in North America. What were prehistoric camelids were here in North America about 40 million years or so ago. And
interesting. I had no idea that they're actually basically prehistoric camelids in the United States, so to speak.
In the United States.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what happened, oh gosh, this was about 3 million years ago or so, that the way the continents were together, there was the ability for migration up across Alaska and into Asia. And so the camelids that were part of the United States or part of North America migrated up.
Right, Canada. Can't forget Canada, right?
Yep, up through Canada, yep. And on into Alaska, and then I crossed over on into Asia. And those became the camels. So the dromedary camels and the Bactrian camels over in Asia.
Okay.
There was also then migration that went south, and they went down through what's now wasn't then, but what now is Mexico and Panama, and then down in South America.
Got it.
But at that same time, and at the ice age that actually occurred at that time, the camelids that were in North America, they basically went extinct. They disappeared from North America. So we had the African and Asian camelids, and then we had the South American camelids. The South American camelids then is what developed on into the two more wild species, the guanaco and the vicuña, and then the two more domesticated species that are the llama and the alpaca. And then probably I'd say it was more or less in the 1980s or so. I don't know when the first llamas and alpacas were imported back up into the United States, but somewhere in that range or so, then people imported some of these llamas and alpacas back up into the United States, and then they developed their livestock production and livestock industry for llamas and alpacas in the United States.